Our guest today, Deanna Witkowski, is an award-winning jazz pianist and composer and former participant in the Collegeville Institute's resident scholar and writing workshop programs. She is recently relocated to Pittsburgh after spending 23 years as a New Yorker. As a frequent guest music leader, Deanna has shared her original liturgical jazz in over 100 churches around the United States. Her 7 recordings include the forthcoming Forces of Nature, entirely comprised of Mary Lou Williams compositions. And you'll hear more about Mary Lou shortly. Another recording, Makes the Heart to Sing Jazz Hymns, features 14 jazz arrangements of classic hymns alongside a companion sheet music book. A noted Mary Lou Williams scholar, Deanna's biography of Mary Lou Williams, entitled Mary Lou Williams, Music for the Soul, will be published by Liturgical Press in August 2021. We're putting links to these resources and places to hear more of Deanna's work in the chat. And be sure to check out Deanna's own website at deannawitkowski.com. So Deanna, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Don. It's a pleasure to be here and welcome. I'm sure all of you can see I'm in a pretty bare room. I'm speaking to you from my new home in Pittsburgh, which is Mary Lou's hometown. So you don't see too much furniture behind me, and I'm going to be playing today on a digital piano that I'm borrowing from a friend because I don't have a piano yet. But it's really a pleasure to be with everyone today. So what I'm going to do is read a couple of excerpts from my Mary Lou Williams biography and then play some pieces in between. And then, of course, at the end, we'll have a chance for questions and answers. So I'd like to start by reading the introduction to my book. Mary Lou Williams is often reduced to a few key phrases that seem to hold meaning, but that all too often become glib summaries that we gloss over as listeners, readers, and musicians. For those not involved in the jazz world, hearing the trope that Williams was one of the only musicians to play through, transcend, and play fluently in all the eras of jazz leads to questions like, what are the eras of jazz? And who cares? And if this woman was such a great musician, why don't jazz musicians play her compositions? Of course, this also leads to the question, why don't we know about her if she was so great? Which can in part be answered by racial sexist systems. But the fact remains that to this day, most jazz musicians know Williams's name and none of her music. Her compositions are not played in piano trios, which is usually piano, bass, and drums, the standard instrumentation in jazz. And while some of her big band music is available and is starting to receive more programming, it's not yet in the regular repertoire of collegiate or professional jazz orchestras. Mary Lou Williams is also reduced when it comes to her spirituality. Some tellings of her life story emphasize how her conversion to Catholicism at the age of 47 ostracized her from other musicians, how she became a religious fanatic, and how her retreat to Catholicism provided a place where she felt safe and where she could stay because, quote, she trusted everybody and was treated so bad, as her first husband, John Williams, said. Her faith is dismissed as a general faith in God and faith in jazz. Yet, as her friend Dorothy Day knew all too well, Christianity is not simply an interior personal faith. It requires seeing God in all things, in all people, and demands that we care for the poor in our midst. Williams cared for the poor and, like Day, chose voluntary poverty in order to rehabilitate the sick in her community, especially jazz musicians. She performed these works of mercy even prior to her religious conversion. A 1950 album cover of a recording by pianist Bud Powell shows Williams, partially hidden, and Powell at an upright piano, perhaps Mary's piano in her Harlem apartment. Mary was a behind-the-scenes, one-woman support system for Powell, not only coaching him musically and recommending him for gigs, but calming him when his mental exhaustion turned into explosive episodes, which led to several stays in mental institutions. What kept this African-American genius musician in the Catholic Church? Why did she stay in what often seems like a patriarchal white religion? Mary's decade-long relationships with priests and women religious did more than help to bring her to the church and to liturgical music in the 60s. These relationships did more than encourage her. They kept her alive. As a prolific letter writer, Williams relied on correspondence with priests, brothers, and women religious, as well as with fans who found healing in her music to sustain her no matter what circumstances she was facing. Williams's generosity was not evident just in her 2 thrift shop ventures and her founding of the Bel Canto Foundation, a charitable nonprofit dedicated to rehabilitating jazz musicians who suffered from drug addiction. Her kind-heartedness was also found in the notes she wrote on torn envelopes, containing letters from fans who shared how their lives had been transformed after they followed her admonitions to go back to church or spoke a kind word with them after the performance. Her scribbled notes often simply said, "Send a recording," meaning her recordings, and send she did. Mary gave away everything she had, her scant physical possessions, her apartment, her music, her time, to save the world. As Dorothy Day said, quoting Dostoevsky, "Beauty will save the world." Mary showed that the discipline, freedom, and beauty inherent in being a jazz musician and a person of faith has the power to heal the troubled soul. A word about my own connection to Williams. As a professional jazz pianist, composer, and liturgical musician, I was introduced to Williams more than 20 years ago. In 1999, I received an invitation from the pianist and educator Dr. Billy Taylor to perform at the Kennedy Center's Mary Lou Williams Women in Jazz Festival. On accepting, I realized that I knew almost nothing about the festival's namesake. Like the majority of jazz musicians, I only knew that Williams had been a lauded pianist-composer who had mentored other jazz stars whose music I did know, pianist Thelonious Monk and saxophonist Charlie Parker among them. While I'd heard her name revered as an important musician, I did not know a single one of her compositions. I asked myself why I had never heard any of this woman's music. My eagerness to learn more about Mary Lou came at an opportune time. Morning Glory, a new Williams biography by Linda Dahl, had just been published. Trumpeter Dave Douglas had recently released a Williams tribute album, Soul on Soul, so I emailed him and asked for a list of essential Williams recordings. I then started listening to Mary's music and never stopped. From Dahl's biography, I learned that Williams was a liturgical jazz pioneer who had composed 3 mass settings. I was astonished. Just 2 years earlier, I'd relocated from Chicago to New York to serve as a music director at All Angels Episcopal Church. I'd recently composed my 2nd jazz mass for the congregation and had begun to present my music in churches outside of New York. I realized that I shared a common goal with Williams, whether composing for a specific congregation or playing in a jazz club, to make jazz, or more broadly, all of my original work, accessible to all. Like Williams, I believe that jazz should be played everywhere, in the club, community center, on the sidewalk, in church. In Williams, I had unexpectedly found a soul companion and lifelong mentor. Over the intervening years, Mary, whom from this point on I will call by her first name, has become more and more a part of my life. As an adult convert to Catholicism, who converted through the influence of the Jesuits, even attending a lay spirituality program at the same parish where Mary presented St. Martin de Porres, her first major liturgical work in the early 60s, I began to realize that I was literally walking in Mary's footsteps. As a musician who presents jazz in churches of all different denominations, I often picture Mary seated at the piano in St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue, playing her joyous Mary Lou's Mass with her trio in front of 3,000 people as 5 priests process to the altar. Mary gives me courage. Sometimes I speak with her before I play, knowing that in a very real sense, she has been here before me. Once I began spending extended time in her hometown of Pittsburgh in the fall of 2019, I came to realize that the warmth that I felt in the welcoming, soulful people in the city where she grew up was the same warmth I've experienced in all of Mary's playing. Now, I too call Pittsburgh home. Each time I step onto the stage to play mere feet from the Charles Teeny Harris photo of Mary that hangs proudly at the Pittsburgh Jazz Club, Con Alma, I send a quick prayer to her, thanking her for being with me, and then I start pressing down the keys, letting the sound, the space, and everything it has taken to get me to this moment all come out. I hope that a fraction of what I feel when I play is expressed in these pages, and that Mary's story will bring you to what for her was the most important thing, her music. I wasn't expecting to get emotional, but it's really taken me a lot to get to Pittsburgh, and that there's actually, if you go to my website, there's a whole blog post about that. So Mary Lou was definitely a big part of my life, and I'd like to play an early piece from her. This is something she wrote in 1944. So this is a period, Mary Lou was born in 1910 in Atlanta. She grew up here in Pittsburgh. And for 12 years, until 1942, she was a very important early big band pianist and arranger with a group called Andy Kirk and his 12 Clouds of Joy. They were based in Kansas City, Missouri, and they toured a lot in the Midwest and the South before becoming really big and doing recordings in Chicago and New York. And soon after Mary left that band, after being with them for 12 years, which is a really long time to be traveling on the road, she started touring for about 6 months as a staff arranger with Duke Ellington, the composer. And so during that time, while she was with Ellington, she wrote the next piece I'm going to play for you. It's something she wrote for Ellington, but he never recorded it. It's been recorded by the Dutch Jazz Orchestra recently in the last few years, but Mary Lou recorded it herself as a solo piece, a trio piece, and I believe a septet piece, all in 1944. And this is called Lonely Moments. I'm going to play one more piece for you now, and this is something that Mary Lou wrote about a year after she wrote Lonely Moments. So in 1945, she wrote a piece that is known as being one of her major pieces called the Zodiac Suite. And actually the recording she did of this with a trio last year, now in 2019, was placed in the Grammy Hall of Fame. And it was a piece where she took the 12 signs of the zodiac, and for each sign she wrote a different movement that corresponded to, usually to musicians who had their birthdays under that sign. And while she did this at first recording with her trio, she also scored this for a chamber orchestra and had that piece done in Town Hall on New Year's Eve of coming up for 46, and then did a larger thing with the Carnegie Pops Orchestra, a 70-piece orchestra, that following spring. So I recorded on the upcoming release Force of Nature that features all Mary Lou compositions with my trio. We did 3 movements from the Zodiac, so I'm going to play one of them for you now. This is Taurus. I'm going to go back and read another excerpt from the book. And this is, there's 10 chapters in the book, so this is from chapter 8. This is a period starting in 1967, which is when this excerpt picks up soon after Mary Lou. She's been living in New York City since the 40s, And in early 1967, she was commissioned by a group of New York Jesuit priests to write new liturgical music for a concert at Carnegie Hall that was called Praise the Lord in Many Voices. And that concert had 6 different composers. Mary Lou was one of them. David Amram was another important composer on that program, where they each wrote new sacred music. And this is where Mary Lou starts to write some of the music that begins, that she uses later on in several of her masses. She wrote 3 complete jazz masses. And about 2 months after she performed at Carnegie Hall, she goes back to Pittsburgh, and she's teaching in a Catholic school here in the Brookline neighborhood for, I know I have some Pittsburgh friends watching, called Seton High School. And she has a group of about 14 girls who are students in a music theory class that she's teaching. And she says that she starts to write the mass there because she's trying to teach them music theory, and it's just kind of not that interesting to them. So she starts writing music to help them understand music theory, and she starts writing her first mass, which is known as the Pittsburgh Mass, in that particular school situation. So soon after she leaves Pittsburgh, comes back to her apartment in New York, she's robbed. This is something, her apartment gets broken into a lot throughout her life. And she's trying to find more freelance work. She's not sure what to do. She goes back to see if Ellington, who she hasn't worked with since the 40s, will have her arrange for him again. And she writes several arrangements for him and is not paid. So she's kind of in a very frustrating place. She's trying to figure out what is next. And this is where the excerpt picks up. Mary's financial worries were compounded by health issues. Writing to her friend, a Franciscan priest named Brother Mario, she listed her troubles, numbering each. She began, 1. I've been sitting in the house since August 25th writing for Duke Ellington, and it doesn't seem I'm getting any loot for it. He's begged me since 41 to write for him. That is, pleaded. 2, I have kidney and bladder ailment. And this, just a note, she eventually, in 1981, died from bladder cancer. This is when she starts having medical issues. 3, during the course of writing, I left the house to go to the post office, probably to send Ellington the new pieces, and someone broke in and robbed me of my TV, new typewriter, and the only good piece of luggage I had. Mary also mentioned her concern for her nephew, Robbie, who she had been trying to help by asking various priests to assist him in applying to boarding schools. But Mary confided in Brother Mario that Robbie hadn't got a chance and expressed her own exhaustion, describing herself as old and haggard. In October, Mary's spirits were lifted on receiving a letter from Father Bob Ledigar, a Mary Knoll priest, who was a new appointee to the Music Advisory Board of the U.S. Bishops' Commission on the Liturgical Apostolate, working with a group of Harlem Catholic parishes to commission a series of seasonal masses by local African-American composers. Ledigar approached Mary about writing a mass setting for Lent. The masses would be part of a series of, quote, experiments in Sunday worship of a more contemporary style to take place at St. Thomas the Apostle Church on West 118th Street. Working with St. Thomas's pastor, Father Kevin Kelly, Ledigar had already contacted 2 additional composers, Billy Taylor, Mary's longtime friend since the 50s, and Eddie Bonamere, who had studied with Mary in the 40s. In addition to his work as a public school music teacher, Bonamere was the choir director at St. Thomas and had premiered his own jazz liturgy, Missa Hodierna, the previous year at Harlem's St. Charles Borromeo Church. Ledigar invited Bonamere to compose an Advent Mass and to serve as music director for the project. Excited by the prospect of writing a new Mass that would be sung for all 6 Sundays of Lent, Mary readily agreed to write the second Mass in the series. After meeting in person, Father Ledigar sent scripture text to Mary to consider as a starting point, writing, quote, I hope you take them as ideas to work with, not as something that can't be changed. The most important thing is to have parts that the people can sing, that can be taught to them in a few minutes without their having to read music. Ledogar contributed his own text to the Kyrie. This is something you can't do now. Adding the text for our lack of hope, for our failure to care, for letting ourselves be paralyzed with fear. Lord have mercy. Mary wrote an easy-to-teach setting with the youth choir singing the new text and the assembly joining in on the calls for mercy. To augment St. Thomas's youth choir, Mary recruited children from the community center where she taught music during the week. She also formed an instrumental sextet including saxophone, flute, guitar, bass, and drums with herself at the organ, as St. Thomas had no piano. Honey Gordon, the vocalist who had sung Mary's Our Father at the Carnegie Hall concert, led the congregation as cantor. In an effort to record her Lenten Mass, Mary reached out to Mo Ash, asking if he would bring a crew to record one of the Sunday services for release on the Folkways record label. And she had worked with Folkways in the 40s. Although Ash did record one of the liturgies, nothing further was done with the tape, probably due to poor sound quality. But for all of her unsuccessful efforts to have this major work recorded, Mary missed out on an opportunity right under her nose. 6 weeks before the premiere, Ledogar informed Mary that he had received a call from Omer Westendorf, the president of the World Library of Sacred Music. Westendorf wanted to record and publish Mary's new work so that other assemblies could use the sheet music. In a January 1968 letter postscript to Ledogar, Westendorf wrote, quote, "It is growing very late to promote a Lenten Mass for this coming Lent. If Mary Lou Williams would get the music to us soon, perhaps we can still get it in production and advertise it." There is no record of Mary having provided a score to either Ledogar or Westendorf, and, like her earlier Mass, the Pittsburgh Mass, the only score and recording of Mass for the Lenten season are housed at the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers University. On March 3rd, 1968, Mass for the Lenten season premiered at St. Thomas the Apostle, with Mary at the organ and Bonamere conducting. As evidenced on a homemade recording, the Psalm 27 setting of "The Lord is my light and my helper, of whom shall I be afraid?" comforts and encourages in a melody that stays in one's ear, and the Kyrie with Ledogar's new text enlivens the assembly's cries for God's mercy. Perhaps most dramatically, Mary's use of solo voice and acoustic bass on the anamnesis, "Dying you destroyed our death, rising you restored our life," with the entire congregation joining in singing the final phrase, feels like a resurrection in body, spirit, and community. One of the congregants who sang Mary's new Mass was Dorothy Day, founder of the Catholic Worker. Day and Mary had been introduced via Janet Burwash, a former volunteer at Mary's first thrift shop. Day wrote of her experience attending Mass on the third Sunday of Lent, quote, "I have just come from a glorious celebration, the 11 o'clock Mass at St. Thomas. One came away feeling as though one had truly celebrated Mass, offering worship, adoration, glory to God, not to speak of penitence. There was a climax of beauty at the singing of the choir after the Sanctus. As for the great Ailment, which is still more or less ignored in all our local churches, it is hard to describe the ecstatic glory to God, to Jesus Christ, and the half-dozen repeated Amens, followed by a final strong one sung by the entire congregation. This was a musical event, and I do not think there has been anything to compare with it in any of the so-called folk masses being sung in colleges and churches around the country." Mary wrote today expressing her gratitude, saying, "Thank you very much for coming to the Mass. Was quite surprised. You inspired everyone." In the same letter and in several to follow, Mary mentioned her financial strain. It appears that Day was trying to help Mary apply for a grant. Mary wrote, quote, Father Gensel, pastor of the jazz community at St. Peter's Lutheran Church, Father Liturgical, and Billy Taylor are supposed to talk about putting on a benefit for me to raise over $1,500 to pay my bills. You know, Dorothy, it's difficult to do things I'm trying to do when there's no salary coming in. And I have been very fortunate. Father Kelly at St. Thomas and Bishop Wright in Pittsburgh are the only ones that are salary-minded. 3 nights before Mary's final liturgy on Palm Sunday, every television and radio in the country broadcast the shocking news that Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. Day wrote in The Catholic Worker of her experience of receiving the news, describing how music, and Mary's in particular, had helped her. Quote, "Always I think I will weep when I hear the song, 'We Shall Overcome.' But the healing of grief is in those words that I had been hearing sung every Sunday at St. Thomas in the Mass composed by Mary Lou Williams, herself a Black composer and jazz musician, herself internationally famous. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me shall never die, but have life everlasting." Mary responded immediately to Dr. King's death by writing 2 pieces that she taught to the St. Thomas Youth Choir. Tell Him Not to Talk Too Long sets a portion of King's February 4th, 1968 sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Mary's birthplace of Atlanta. Mary only slightly paraphrases King's original speech in the first verse, which part of that reads, "If you're around when I meet my day, don't want a long funeral. And if somebody delivers the eulogy, tell him not to talk too long." The blues-inflected song contrasts with the jazz waltz feel of "I Have a Dream," based on a portion of King's speech from the 1963 March on Washington. Day invited Mary to share her musical tribute the following July at the annual Pax Christi Conference held at the Catholic Worker Farm in Tivoli, New York. 2 days after Easter Sunday, Mary wrote to Day from Pittsburgh, saying that she was taking a breathing spell, but Mary never rested for long. She now expressed her desire to do a concert for the Pope. She had been trying to find a way to get her Lenten Mass performed in Rome, writing to Brother Mario and other religious for assistance. While Mario assured her that he could get the North American college seminarians to sing the Mass, he explained that an audience with the Pope would probably be impossible. But with her typical determination, Mary worked on lining up gigs in Copenhagen, figuring that if she could get herself to Denmark, it would only be a short matter of time before she could travel to Rome to have her Mass performed there. Father McNaspy of the New York Jesuits had already recommended that Mary's portion of the 1967 Carnegie Hall concert be aired on Vatican radio, and Mary was sure that other opportunities would follow. Mary's tenacity paid off. She received an offer to play at a new club in Copenhagen and planned to leave for Europe in early May of 1968. But the day before her departure, her sister Grace attempted suicide. Mary delayed her trip, staying in Pittsburgh to spend time with her family before playing at the Catholic Workers' July Conference in Tivoli. 2 weeks later, she boarded a German steamer for her second trip to Europe, one that would lead her to Rome and to a commission to write her third and most well-known Mass, Music for Peace. So I'm going to play one piece from that is something that Mary Lou premiered at that 1967 Carnegie Hall concert, and that she also then used in her first Mass setting in the Pittsburgh Mass in '67, as well as in Music for Peace, which she wrote in 1969 and 1970. And my favorite version of this is actually it's only on a vinyl recording as far as I know, of that Praise the Lord in Many Voices concert from Carnegie Hall. It's the only recording or performance I've heard of the full choral version of this piece. When she recorded it later, it was with Carlene Ray, who was a wonderful electric bass player and vocalist with a very distinctive low voice, almost a contralto voice. But the Carnegie concert is the one that's with the full choir. So this will obviously not be with a full choir, it'll just be me. But this is Mary's setting of the Our Father. If you look on YouTube, if you just type in the search for Mary Lou's Mass, which is another name that her third Mass is known by, Music for Peace, you can find a really beautiful clip of that piece of the Lord's Prayer with dancer Judith Jameson, who was for many years in the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater Company, and Alvin Ailey choreographed a whole work to Mary Lou's third Mass. So some of that, you can find that Our Father portion on YouTube, and it's really beautiful. So far I've just given you some very different periods of Mary's life, and what I wanted to do to close, to play one other piece, is to share one of my arrangements from my last recording. So you heard me play the Zodiac Suite, which is going to be on the upcoming recording, Force of Nature. And my prior recording to that, that I released 4 years ago, was called Makes the Heart to Sing, Jazz Hymns. And inspired by Mary Lou, but also it was something I had already been doing when I first started finding out about Mary Lou's work, really trying to get congregations to sing fully, to participate fully, and to have to use jazz music in doing that. I did a recording where I took a lot of traditional hymn tunes and did arrangements where I either changed some of the chords or the rhythms or different things, but in a way where people could still sing with us, although the record itself is instrumental trio. So I'm going to just play instrumentally one tune from that record. This is my arrangement of All Creatures of Our God and King. So that is my entire portion of what I have prepared, and I think we're going to see, Don's going to see if there's any questions that came up.
Yes. The first question is one I have. It's really interesting, this relationship between Dorothy Day and Mary Lou Williams. And I'd never heard that before until this day.
That doesn't surprise me. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's how much of you mind? Is there more? Is there more to be known, or do you know more that
Well,
you can
so
tell
I
us?
went through, I mean, I had found, so originally in, I referenced like in my introduction, this early, there's two other biographies besides mine of Mary Lou's. And I had read in the first one, Dorothy Day's name came up in like one sentence. And so I thought, I gotta find out, like, what is this about? So I went to I digitally, of course, everything with COVID. I contacted someone at Marquette University where Dorothy Day's papers are, and I said, are there any letters? Because I had already seen about 3 letters from Williams to Day at Mary Lou's archives are at Rutgers University, at the Institute of Jazz Studies, and I had read those, but you never get to see both sides usually of the letters. And so the archivist at Marquette sent me about 4 or 5 letters that were from Dorothy Day to Williams. So from what I can gather, and I also talked to Jim Forrest, so Jim was actually at that Tivoli conference where Mary Lou played, but he didn't know really anything about, I was asking him about Mary Lou's relationship with Dorothy Day. I do know that while Mary Lou was in Denmark in the late 60s, she was writing to Dorothy a fair amount, and Dorothy was trying to, just offer encouragement, basically. I'm sure, I haven't really found, I'm sure there's more of a story that Mary Lou probably spent time at the Catholic Worker. Yeah, but especially because, so I mentioned this in here but didn't go into detail because it's in other parts of the book about Mary Lou had a couple of thrift shops where she used the funds she would raise from the thrift shop to basically support this nonprofit she started to help rehabilitate jazz musicians who had issues with various forms of addiction. And it was while she was there, a volunteer who worked there a lot, named Janet Burwash, was the person who connected her to Dorothy Day. So I'm sure there's a lot more there, but I haven't seen anything beyond this handful of letters on either side.
I don't want to get too jazz wonky here, but you've turned me on to Mary Lou Williams music, and I'm just absolutely astonished. I'm stunned that I don't know this better. But in other concerts I've heard you play, I notice, I think I hear Thelonious Monk, and I kind of position her in my own mind somewhere between Ellington and Monk. You think that's accurate? I mean, there's certainly a lot of unusual placements of accented beats in Mary Lou Williams.
Well, I would actually say that some things that you hear in Monk come from Mary Lou. So there's, like, for instance, we recorded something on the new, well, not out yet, but the coming out in the fall record, called John Mealy's Jam Session. And I think that's from like 46 or something like that. And Mary Lou has all these bridges, which often come in the middle part of a tune, I'll say, that really sound to me like, Monk stuff. They're really chromatic. So she has this part that's, see if I can play it without. I can't do the whole melody there. Something like that. But like, that's something you totally associate with Monk. And the two of them were very good friends. So they met in Kansas City I mean, before Mary Lou had moved to New York. So I don't know that I positioned Mary, between them. I mean, her style also changed a lot. And that's one thing that's pretty interesting. If you hear, we also recorded a tune from one of her later albums in the 70s called Zoning, where it's like there's a lot of funk and electric bass on it, and stuff that still sounds really modern.
Hmm.
So I think she's kind of her
Yeah.
own thing.
Yeah. Well, so that for anybody who doesn't know who Thelonious Monk, he is really famous in the jazz world. I mean, about as famous as you can get. And it's kind of interesting that everybody knows him and very few people know Mary Lou Williams, where
Right.
Monk seems to have gotten inspiration. But we do have a question about the inspiration that goes the other way. Where did Mary Lou draw her inspiration as a composer and a performer?
Well, I think so. Mary Lou, so early on when she was growing up in Pittsburgh, she talks about how her mother never let her take piano lessons because her mother was afraid if she took like formal music lessons and learned to read music scores, that she would lose the ability to improvise. So Mary learned really by being a sponge from like different traveling musicians that would come through town. And she talks about when she was really young in Pittsburgh, she had people who would like take her out to clubs and things. I mean, when she was underage, so she could go hear music. And also she was doing gigs. I mean, her stepfather, Fletcher Burley, would like hide her under an overcoat and take her out to like poker games, or she would play and everybody would, put money in the tip jar. But she talks about, it's interesting, some early influences. She talks about Lovey Austin, who was a blues pianist based in Chicago. She heard Lovey Austin in Pittsburgh. She talks about Jack Howard, who was an early stride pianist that we don't hear about, was from Pittsburgh. And then she has influences from like Earl Father Hines. She really, and then if you're talking about her arranging, I mean, that's a whole kind of other piece. When she was influenced by people like Don Redman, Edgar Sampson, and but her as far as style went, like, she doesn't talk a lot about after her like growing up years about who she was really totally getting into. So there's periods, like for instance when she was writing Zodiac Suite, where there were certain classical composers she was checking out, for writing. But I would say early influences are definitely kind of, a couple of those Pittsburgh pianists that I mentioned, especially Earl Hines, Jack Howard. She talks about Lovey Austin a lot. So those are a few.
We have another question that came in. So this relationship between jazz and liturgical music, obviously Mary Lou wrote masses, but do you see a connection between the liturgical aspect of her music and jazz prior to that? I mean, in her earlier music? Or is this something that comes later in her career?
Well, so she starts writing her first real, and I wouldn't even say that call this liturgical because it doesn't really fit anywhere like in the service. If you're thinking of like liturgical music as it has to function somewhere in the service, as say the Kyrie or something. So in 1962, she writes this piece for Saint Martin de Porres, who had been the first a person of color to be canonized in the Catholic Church, and was a really big deal for Black Catholics. Like, there had been a lot of work to get de Porres canonized. And Mary Lou, for a period of time in the mid-50s, she had gone to Europe, where she thought she was going to be there for like a 2 or 3 week tour, and she ends up staying for 2 years. And it's kind of while she's there that she has the beginnings of kind of like a spiritual awakening. And after she comes back to the States, she stops performing in public for about 3 years, more or less. Although she still records a little, she still plays a little in like in the basement of a Catholic church that she starts visiting. I didn't really talk about her conversion so much, but that's a whole interesting story in itself. I wanted to get to things that really aren't in the other books today. But just to say that, so she converts to Catholicism in 57, and has this still period of like, she's not sure if she should be playing jazz music or not, if it's something that's I think also because she had so many friends die of drug addiction, especially when Charlie Parker died right after she got back from Europe. She felt like she was supposed to save him. And I think in some way she felt guilt around that. And so she kind of questions if club environments, where at the time it was not that hard to find drugs, if that's an environment she should be in, or kind of like almost promoting by playing there. So she begins in this period where she's turning towards religion, she's trying out different churches and things. After she converts and Martin de Porres is canonized, that is sort of her inspiration for actually getting to start writing sacred music. So she has she writes this massive choral work with lyrics by her spiritual confessor, Father Anthony Woods, that's on her record called Mary Lou Williams Presents Black Christ of the Andes, and that came out in 63. And that piece is pretty amazing. It's very hard for even professional choirs to sing because the harmonies are so tight. She's kind of writing things that sound, really close together like piano voicings. So after this, it's another 5 years before she starts writing her masses. But I didn't get into this part either, but there were a lot of composers writing jazz masses in 1964, 65, 66. She had priests, she says she had priests bugging her, like as soon as she was, decided she's going to become Catholic. In 57, she talks about specific priests who were saying, Mary Lou, why don't you write a jazz mass? And she says, why should I write one? Everyone's already written one. And that may sound really odd today, because you don't think of jazz masses as being something super common. I mean, that's why, I've written a couple, and when I found out about Mary Lou, it was like, oh my goodness, like, I have to check all this stuff out. But yeah, she really didn't start doing liturgical stuff until the 60s.
Great. Well, that's fantastic. And we're at the end of our time, Deanna. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your music with us. This has been spectacular.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you online for joining us today. We invite you to join us for future Collegeville Connection events. Please watch for event information and registration details on our website and social media platforms. Next Wednesday, April 21, same time, noon to 1 Central Time, as part of our celebration of National Poetry Month, you'll have the opportunity to hear from 3 award-winning poets affiliated with the Collegeville Institute. Actually 4, we hope: Susan Sink, Angela O'Donnell, Shan Ray, and Betsy Johnson. Each will be reading from their recent collections. So again, thank you very much, Deanna, for joining us. Good wishes to all of you. Hope to see you next week.